ask questions, but hi everyone, welcome to Doing Sociology. A very warm welcome to you and to our panelists today who will be talking to us today about their book, which is titled Shifting Landscapes, Education and Urban Transformations in India. And today we have the editors of the book with us, Geetha, Nambissan, Nandini, Manjrekar, Shivali, Tukdeo, Indra, Sengupta. We're so glad to have you all. We're also very happy that so many, audience members, participants have joined us today. And before we begin today's discussion, I'm sure all of you are, familiar with the editors. I'll quickly introduce them. Geetha Nambissan retired as professor from the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research has focused on marginal groups in Indian society, including Dalits and Adivasis and the urban poor. She has also been interested in the social implications of increasing privatization of education. She is the India section editor of Second International Handbook of Urban Education, Volume 1, which was published by Springer in 2017, and one of the associate editors of the Oxford Encyclopedia of School Reform, published in 2022. She has served on the editorial board of Contemporary Education Dialogue and has been a member of the advisory boards of the Journal of Education Policy and London Review of Education. We have with us Nandini Manjrekar, who retired as a professor and dean from the School of Education at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research interests are located at the intersection of education and gender studies. She has taught postgraduate courses in sociology and history of schooling and education in the Indian context, women's studies and childhood studies, areas within which she has also published research papers. Her publications include a reader titled Gender and Education in India, published in 2021. She has served on the editorial board of the journal Comparative Education Dialogue and is currently on the editorial advisory board of the Indian Journal of Gender Studies. Shivali Tukdeo is professor at the Indira Mahindra School of Education at Mahindra University, Hyderabad. Her main areas of research include education policy, sociology of education, global policy reforms, and the impact of urban transformation on education. Her book, India Goes to School, Education Policy and Cultural Politics, was published in 2019. The book pays attention to the production, reformulation, and circulation of education policy ideas in India. Her preoccupations, especially in the past few years, include new knowledge regimes in education and their connections to the large-scale transformations in India. And finally, we have Indira Sengupta, who's a senior research fellow and the head of the India Research Program at the German Historical Institute, London. She's a historian of knowledge practices in colonial contexts. She has jointly edited with Daud Ali the volume Knowledge Production, Pedagogy and Institutions in Colonial India, published in 2011. She's currently revising a manuscript, Preserving India's Past, Law, Bureaucracy and Historical Conservation in Colonial India, 1904 to 25, under contract with Routledge, and completing another edited volume, Other Histories, Other Pasts, which is under contract with Routledge too. Well, a very warm welcome to all of you. We're so glad to be discussing a book which is very timely, talking about transformations in India, urban transformations, and the related transformations which have taken place within education. To sort of begin our conversation, maybe we could hear from all the editors about the book, its inception. So Professor Nambissan, maybe we could hear you first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doing Sociology, Rituparna and Dipali, right, for holding this discussion of our book. You have given us 8-9 minutes, so in this brief time, I thought I will begin by sharing why we felt that the theme of this book is important, how we framed the theme, and briefly comment on one section of the book. My co-editors will focus on the others. As our subtitle indicates, our focus is on education and urban transformations in India, and this book is a plea for more research to understand how education is shaped in complex ways by the changing urban landscapes, and to underscore that spatial justice is crucial to social justice. Urban studies scholars have pointed to the rapid spread of urbanization in post-independence India and highlighted the varied trajectories of individual cities that are influenced not only by neoliberal urbanization post the 1990s, but they also highlight the need to locate the changing city in diverse histories, cultures, socio-economic changes, state policy, as well as the aspirations and strategies of individual families over time. Urban India is characterized by increasing spatial polarization and sharpening inequalities, resulting in complex forms of exclusions and marginalities based on class, caste, ethnicities, and so on, with intersections of gender. The urban poor, most of who come to the city as impoverished rural migrants and have been integral to the building, building it, are increasingly being relegated to its margins socially and spatially. While urban studies scholars have highlighted significant transformations of spatial, social, and cultural landscapes of cities, they have, with few exceptions, ignored how education is embedded in these processes. Researchers on education in India, on the other hand, have also largely failed to locate schools within the schools and educational institutions within the changing context of the city. This is surprising, as the Indian city has been a site of educational opportunities viewed as pathways to social mobility from colonial times, both by the higher and middle caste as well as Dalit communities. And especially so in the post-independence decades of rapid urbanization. In the last few decades, education has also become a fast-growing sector of the urban economy. Research has showed that institutions such as education are also exclusionary, and structural inequalities and marginalization mediate access to schools, participation within them, and influence educational outcomes and futures of children and youth in the city. Our aim was to study the changing urban education interface and present this as an exciting and unexplored research area for young scholars and build interdisciplinary conversations between urban studies and education studies. In 2017, we, the editors, came together to research education and the changing urban. The details of our project, etc., are in our book. We conceptualize the urban as socially structured, diverse, and changing spaces that are continuously in the making, with processes, webs of social relations that extend well beyond the geography of the city and its peripheries, and are also constituted by settlements within it. Cities are mentioned as mentioned, are segregated, unequal spaces, and hence it was important that our research was also influenced by a relational framework of exclusion and privilege shaped by diverse intersectional inequalities and marginalities. It was important to keep in mind Soja's critical perspective, which draws attention to the geographical aspects of injustice and the need for fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources, in this case, education also, and opportunities to use them. The 12 chapters in the volume are grouped into 4 parts that deal with different urban forms. I mean, that's the way we've sort of structured the volume. The first, City Histories and Educational Past, focuses on the early urban. The second, Urban Transformations, Marginalities and Education, dwells on the metropolitan megacity, and that is, a lot of research is focused on the metropolitan and megacities. The third, Beyond the Metropolis, Urban Spaces, Education and Changing Aspirations, draws attention to the lesser studied small city and town. And the last explores neighborhoods, minorities, and the politics of education in the metropolitan city. There are overlaps in themes across chapters such as marginalities, privilege, exclusion, and aspirations across different social locations and along varied timelines and play out in different ways. And you can see these in the different chapters. I will briefly speak about what is the third section in a few minutes. Urban education dynamics in what we have called non-metropolitan spaces that are, small towns, smaller cities, and so on. So we have the small town of Piparia, Raichur, which is a backward district, and you have Raichur town in that in Karnataka, Piparia in Madhya Pradesh, and the city of Banaras. Since I have only, I think, 2 or 3 minutes, I hope not to flatten out or take away from the extremely fascinating and rich narratives and nuanced discussions that our authors have presented. I mean, I would encourage one must go to the chapters to see how rich they are. If I take a window of changing aspirations, choices, and strategies around education, which is highlighted across chapters and including this, it's clear that one needs to locate these changing aspirations and strategies in specific urban contexts. For instance, in the small town Piparia, you can see a shift in aspirations for higher and professional education for children's futures, and the migration of youth to the larger cities of Bhopal, Indore, and especially Pune to access these opportunities. And this is very striking post the 1970s and 80s. So migration is used as a mobility strategy by middle classes, old and new. There were a lot of new social classes because until the 70s, there was, the Nehruvian development model. So, agricultural development, so you had traders and rich landlords. So migration is used as a mobility strategy by the middle classes because the small town that had become economically stagnant post the 1980s was unable to offer these educational opportunities. However, migration for education and social mobility is not a possibility for the poor, lower caste, Adivasi groups who are now on Piparia's spatial fringe, and they have to make do with the increasingly neglected and inadequate publicly funded education that is available to them, or the unaffordable private schools that are now emerging and dotting the city's fringes, and the also emerging unregulated low-cost school and coaching market. So this is the kind of scenario there as far as in Raichur, one finds that skill development programs are being offered to youth from low-income and poor families in the last decade with the promise of social mobility through employment in the service sector. But these short-term skills are targeted towards the urban sector, service sector, rather than local needs and the local context. This forces youth to migrate to Bangalore, where the jobs they get and the living conditions are unsustainable. In Banaras, there are also aspirations for and strategies to access modern English medium education among the lower classes. But this again plays out differently in this urban context. Banaras has historically been a center for culture with diverse systems of indigenous education, spatial embeddedness of families and school within neighborhoods, gender norms, the long shadow of the metropolis defining what is desirable English education and cultural capital, and the growing private school sector on the fringes of the city bring in different sets of dynamics and inequalities. So one has to locate it. These studies draw attention to larger linkages across and within the urban, raising questions around urban and education policy, which I can elaborate later. Thus, we argue that questions of education in the city must be linked to the historical development of urban forms and spatio-social restructuring and marginalization that need focused research attention. The spatial question is critical in the struggle for the right to the city and its resources, including education, and is important in building new imaginaries around a more inclusive, spatially and socially just urban. The COVID-19 pandemic set in just as we finished our research. The devastation to lives, livelihood, and education, especially of the already vulnerable urban poor, make the concerns our volume has raised extremely urgent. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Nambissan. Thank you for giving us the outline of the book and also sort of flagging off the key themes that the book goes through. And, you've detailed some of, taking the case of Banaras and Raichur, you've, highlighted some of the critical themes that the book touches upon. And from here, I'd like to move on to Professor Manjrekar, and maybe you could come in now and talk about the book.
Actually, I think it's possible, if it's possible, we will ask Shivali to speak because she will continue from, is that okay, Shivali?
Sure.
Continue
Sure.
from the framing that
Yes.
Geetha provided. Yeah?
Yes.
I'll speak
yes.
after her.
Yes. Thank you. Are you able to hear me okay? All right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Rituparna, Dipali, and everyone at Doing Sociology for this. It's really great to be here. So I want to pick up on what Professor Geetha sort of placed in her opening remarks, and because there are, there's continuity, so maybe I'll sort of start now, which is basically the framing of the volume in terms of disciplinary intersections that it offers, including the methods as well as the lens of analysis. And I think such a framing allows us to understand a wide range of phenomena, processes, and places. So from regions, from smaller towns such as Raichur and Peparia to the metropolis, and in between. Also, it allows us to make sense of the shifts at different temporal axes as well. So if we look closely at how the regions have developed over the past few decades, it's quite apparent that education and urban are in fact co-constituted. They're not necessarily very different things, but they are very much integrated and they're shaping each other. So a cursory look tells us that there are several parallels between the two. For instance, growth of cities and expansion of educational institutions, or greater selectivization in some parts of the city, and also greater sort of focus on exclusive schooling for the few. These practices. Also, we see what is often called as zones of abundance and zones of neglect. Neglect sort of being together in the same space, something that we observe in our cities, small towns. We also observe as far as institutions of learning are concerned. So the overlaps are very many, and that's a good way to begin our inquiry into education and urban. So in this particular context, one of the major questions that our volume tackles is how the cityscapes interact with large-scale social changes. So today I will speak mostly about the large-scale transformations, the large overarching social changes, something that we cover in our section 2 of the volume. So just to give a little bit of context of the large transformations in the past few decades, the macro picture of urban restructuring has involved fairly aggressive changes in cities that are driven largely by the push of what is known as the development agendas, right? So including innovation in infrastructure, push for transportation, different types of transportations, push for certain kinds of businesses, and definitely a support for consumption-oriented practices and consumption-oriented sort of places, luxury-oriented places, leisure-oriented spaces of a particular kind in cities. So we also want to flag here the categories such as mega cities, small cities, world-class cities, global cities that have appeared in the universe of planning, urban planning, for the explicit purpose of carrying out these different large-scale transformations, different urban projects. So the imaginary of a mega city or world-class city includes mechanisms to carve special spaces within or adjacent to the existing cities, right? So these are called, these are sort of spaces of exception. So you have a city and then there are special enclaves, special, spaces that are being made as part of these larger agendas of transformation, larger agendas of urban development. Scholars of urban studies have long noted that global uh, cities are now the important nodes in the network of connected cities across the world, and they have become closer to each other than ever in terms of the features that they offer, the ambience, etc. So the cities, regardless of where they are, what their histories are, they are supposed to look similar to each other in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of certain things that they offer. Obviously, they're with some cultural specificities, and that is the imagination of a global city, of a city that is that has a lot in common with cities across the world. So there are 3 empirical chapters in this volume that address the ideas around transformation very seriously. And the authors probe also the extent and depth of transformation. So the main question really is what happens to the integral infrastructure of the city, including its various institutions, neighborhoods, livelihoods, places of livelihood, so places of just to mingle when such an aggressive restructuring happens in our cities, right? So we locate education as part of the realm which is integral to cities' infrastructure, public education, or any other form of education as well. So educational institutions are fairly integral to any landscape. So when such an aggressive restructuring happens, what happens to these institutions is an opening question to kind of think about these issues. What appears to be quite evident is that as the cities move towards enclave-like private forms of residence, socialization, and works, all the sort of exclusive spaces designed for these things, similar changes can also be observed in educational spaces. So let me quickly draw in the 3 chapters from this particular section that engage with large-scale urban transformations and education. So the first chapter is about Delhi as the city moves through different labels from mega city to the world-class city. And among various impetus to change and to restructure, one of the impetus was also an aesthetic impetus to kind of construct a broad promenade along the bank of Yamuna River, which led to moving and resettling colonies that had been staying in the neighborhood for a long time. So this particular chapter traces the movement and these changes, these shifts, and it also reminds us of how some educational spaces evoke stigma and shame. And the concept of spatial justice or spatial injustice is very useful here to understand the arbitrary forced movement of populations within the city spaces. So the movement of working populations from the city center to the fringes is also mapped in another chapter, which is which is based in Bangalore, connected with the metro rail construction. And metro rail was an aspirational project, bringing in infrastructure, bringing in a lot of ease as far as the city transport is concerned, etc. But that led to resettlement of 2 bastis for the purposes of construction of metro. And those bastis were relocated in the peri-urban part of the city. So the really the paper sort of draws out how what role education plays in the increasingly precarious conditions of work and unstable sort of conditions of family both. Now I also wanted to kind of draw attention to the ways in which working population, both the cases of Delhi and Bangalore, never feel settled in any ways in the city because they're constantly having to move for one reason or another. And as a result, that also, affects the educational experience of their children. The other chapter that takes forward the theme of large-scale transformation is about Sonepat, Haryana. And in an investigation, almost as like a stunning investigation, the chapter sort of looks at Sonepat, where land has been acquired to construct an educational hub. While large tracts of land have been converted into non-agriculture purposes for a long time, what is significant here is that the land is being transacted in the name of public purpose, which is education, higher education, but ultimately it is converted for private enterprise, and something that has been happening. This is also part of the way in which the peri-urban and rural areas are being increasingly integrated into urban stretches, urban plans. So the intensity and speed of large-scale transformation is such that they're often hard to miss. There are also several smaller changes that are occurring at the same time, perhaps to different degrees. The diversification of schooling, the absence of necessary institutions, public institutions that is, and emergence of speculative markets of education are some of the significant changes that are affecting urban landscapes. It is also important to understand the workings of old and new power in this mix while the things are literally unfolding in the name of urban development. Um, in order to account for what is happening, a historically attentive and interdisciplinary approach is required, and we believe that this volume is a step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tukdeo. Maybe next, Professor Manjrekar, would you like to come in next?
Thank you, Rituparna and Dipali and Doing Sociology for hosting this webinar. I'm going to sort of shift from this wider framing of the book, which Geetha and Shivali have sort of outlined for us, to looking at who is it that matters on the ground? I mean, what is actually happening to people? Where are their experiences and their voices, right, of urban development as we see it today, invoking the sort of critique of the times which they have laid out. And here, what we wanted to bring into the volume was an understanding of, as large-scale changes affect our cities, what really happens to residential settlements within the cities, old and new? And how do we address this? And interestingly, neither, again, urban studies has looked at neighborhoods within the frame of urban studies. Education has looked at sites of education, schooling and education, but often not examined neighborhoods in relation to cities. So this was something that actually, this was an area that we felt would be very important to bring in, especially to also understand how is marginality actually experienced through these shifts, these transformations of the cities and of education itself. I won't repeat what has been said earlier, that education and the urban co-constitute each other. But in terms of what happens at a micro level, how do we sort of understand this in terms of the ways in which marginality gets produced, educational and social marginality? What is the character of those settlements? So we have a section on neighborhoods and minorities. In this section, we have tried to all three papers in this section actually address the metropolitan city, and three different ones: Calcutta, Delhi, and two in Delhi and one in Calcutta. However, I should say that there are other papers as well in the book, and one sees this through the book, that there are, even the paper on, say, looking at Banaras did look at a particular neighborhood as well, or even Piparia did examine the dynamics within a certain area of the town. So we do see this kind of lens, this micro lens that runs through various essays, but in particular these three. So we thought that it would be interesting to look at the question of the neighborhood itself and the production of educational marginality, the question of social stigma within the changing context of the city and of education, through a socio-historical lens on the neighborhood itself, and what is the neighborhood in this context? How do we understand neighborhoods? So although we know that neighborhoods are sort of central to the evolution of modern cities, we have not sort of conceptually brought them into conversation with our understandings within the sociology of education, or perhaps even within history of education. We should remember that perhaps it was really a labor historian, Rajnarayan Chandravarkar, who first drew our attention to the importance of looking at neighborhoods as social institutions within the industrializing city. But what is important to understand perhaps is that the everyday life of the neighborhood, of people in the neighborhood, in many ways the conflicts, the cooperation, the conflict, tensions, proximity of living, what has also been called the sensorial intimacy of those who live, share a space within the city, in the neighborhood, also gives rise finally to questions of what decisions are taken, whether it's school choice or it's parental strategies, how these are actually sort of worked out on the ground in relation, of course, to wider forces outside, wider flows outside, become important. So we do need to see the ways in which the neighborhood itself, are how people actually negotiate the precarity, marginality, stigma of neighborhood itself, as we see it as they are developing within our cities today, particularly if you belong to a particular caste or you belong to a particular religion. And in this case, what we've looked at, so exclusion and privilege also are interesting categories to look at within the context of the neighborhood. And I think this is another aspect that the papers bring out, those that have actually cast a socio-historical micro sort of lens on neighborhood, is the fact that there are fractions, and that, even if we look at the way in which often even sociologists speak of the urban poor, it's far too global a term, and we really have to, and these papers, several of the papers have actually broken down this category within the context of the city. What emerges very clearly, of course, is that what we are talking about are the laboring poor, and we're talking about those situated in the informal labor economy. When it comes to marginal privilege, when it comes to relative privilege, as other papers have also shown in particular areas, those who belong to a particular caste have been able to mobilize some forms of capital. They have been able to at least move towards privilege of a higher order by sending, for example, their children outside to study, or accessing certain institutions which do involve some degree of economic capital, and so on. So the importance of also looking at neighborhoods is in relation to what is happening around us today. And we can see, of course, that these questions of exclusion, social exclusion, particularly when it comes to questions of religious identity, have become far more stark. And the two papers actually in this section talk about two neighborhoods, one in Calcutta, one in Delhi, and look at Muslim communities. And the paper by, say, Anusuya Chatterjee on Park Street, on Park Circus, where she actually does a very interesting historical kind of analysis of the composition of the area, and when certain kinds of moments, historical moments, define who is coming in when, and into what occupations, because occupations seem to be really a very important marker of both stigma as well as relative privilege in neighborhoods. So she does this to show how again the lower middle class sections of Muslims in this area are accessing or aspiring to access children. They reflect certain aspirations for their children involving good education, and are accessing low fee private schools in the area. Most are moving out of government schools. Of course, this is a larger phenomenon. The other area in Bara Hindu Rao in Delhi, which Farah Faruqi has looked at, is again about a community where, about a very, very diverse and heterogeneous Muslim community composed of those who've come in as migrants to Delhi at different points in time, again, going back to that migration goes back to 1857. And so we do have, 100, more than, 100, whatever, 150 years of settlements, which have got impacted at different points in different ways. One, of course, is the recurrent kind of communal tension within the city and in India as a whole. And the other is the shifting out of the slaughterhouses. And how, and in this paper, we see quite clearly how urban transformations impact at the neighborhood level, and what happens to schooling and decisions on schooling, and the effects, the impact of those changes on this particular school in this neighborhood that Farah is discussing, the Shafiq Memorial School. And in fact, the interesting, the questions that she brings up are about how then within this context, how do locally communities fight for citizenship rights, fight for social justice, and when there is a fight for against injustice at the everyday level. The third paper is actually quite interesting and a bit of a contrast, because it is a far newer settlement, and this is Tilak Vihar, which is the widows' colony, which was set up after the anti-Sikh violence in 1984. And here also, it's a paper that actually shows how complex and how fluid questions of identity and precarity can be, because here as well you have different kinds of forces that at one level help residents, and at another level continue the marginalization of the area, and which is extremely gendered because of the nature of the settlement. Because it's a widows' colony. So these questions of stigmatization, marginality, how do we look at questions of spatial justice in very rapidly changing urban sort of scenarios at the micro level, and how do we understand the ways in which the ways in which the socio-historical understanding can help us in sort of bringing out more granularity in our discussion of these neighborhoods. So I think the volume in that sense does something which perhaps has not been attempted in other sociological studies of urban education, because they bring in questions which are again sort of located within sort of contemporary critiques of spatial injustice, but are also looking at far longer histories of these communities and interactions of these communities. I think it is that granularity that I think the papers have been able to introduce, which scholars of urban education can further sort of take ahead. And to me, I think this has been it's very important, because we didn't really have these kinds of studies before, which linked the question of the micro to the macro context of the city and the evolving nature of the city in a social and historical sense. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Professor
I'll
Manjrekar.
take I have, again, I tremendous injustice to the papers, but we can discuss further in the questions. Thanks.
Yes, I'm sure. Thank you for talking about neighborhoods. And then, finally, I'd request the fourth editor, Dr. Sengupta, to, talk about the remaining parts of the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd also like to add my thanks to Dipali and to Rituparna, and for everybody else who's organized this session. Now, I'm a bit of a fish out of water. I'm a historian in a field of in a room of sociologists. So I'll ask you to bear with me. I don't want to, much has been said about the volume, and I think it's time we stop talking about the details, because we want you to read the papers and we want you to read the volume and come back to us. What I'd like to do is to say again one was a problem of how do you organize a volume like this? Because you've gathered how rich and how diverse the papers are. They cover a huge regional compass. They cover a huge span of spatial scales, ranging from the urban to the peri-urban to the suburban, and as the title itself suggests, all the papers talk about transformation, urban transformation, and how do we situate education, especially the education of marginalized groups, in this map of transformation. So when I got into the project, and you will also realize that there are, in the way in which we've organized the volume, there are also some overlaps. One can organize a volume in various different ways. But we thought that it would be useful to pick up on some of the themes that were shouting out to us. And the previous speaker, my colleague Nandini Manjrekar, has already spoken of neighborhoods. Others have referred to transformations in general. And of course, there are many ways of doing it. And you could say the papers on neighborhoods could have gone into the longer historical framings. So this is just a way of, I think when you read the edited volume, we want to take you on a journey into our mindset and how we want you to, our journey through this volume, as it were. So what was my journey? My journey was quite obvious in a way, because the name transformation itself suggests a historical framing. Now, what we realized as we went along, and many of the papers touch on this, is that the long shadow of early modernity and the colonial past, colonial modernity, colonial developments figure in this volume. These phenomena figure not just in the first section that I have edited, and I'll come to that in a minute, but in general, it is about what change, and in what kind of historical framework, what time spans are we talking about? how do neighborhoods change over a long duration framework, and how do they change, say, in the in the phase of neoliberalism? So we were grappling all along with time and change in both larger frameworks and smaller frameworks. So this was obvious. The other was the disciplinary problem, which has also been referred to, but I would just like to come back to this very, very briefly. And that is because we not only was there a particular framing of the urban and the education and education in this sort of common conceptual frame, but we also noticed a disciplinary lacuna that historians, in my case, historians of education, have dealt with, as previous speakers have pointed out, have dealt with institutions, educational institutions. They have dealt with sites, but they have not engaged with the concept of space and place in this sort of framework of what is rural, what is urban, how are these places and sites situated, what is the relationship between what is going on inside institutions and the place around them. So this was one thing. And equally, historians of, urban historians who have done, and there's been a massive amount of work on urban history in the past 2 or 3 decades, and it is not as if they have not been attentive to education. They have, but they have never really engaged, with some exception, and you will find these exceptions also in the volume and in the introduction, to bring them together in one common conceptual frame. How do we read them together in one setting? So just keeping these things in mind, I'd like to draw your attention to the first section of the book, which I edited, which we have given a historical frame, but it could be, you could break it up and do something else with it. But we did start with Akash Bhattacharya's paper on Uttarpara, and this was the peculiar thing because both his paper and Margaret Panau's paper address one central problematic, and that is of the space and the site, and whether these are, do we call them, are they rural, are they urban, are they semi-urban, are they in a process of transition, and when? And the first paper, Akash's paper, is particularly important because he speaks of a very early period of urbanization, and he looks at philanthropic philanthropic or zamindari philanthropy and zamindari capitalism, and how this worked hand in hand with the colonial state to produce an infrastructure project, of which education was one. So when you read the chapter, you realize that the argument is not necessarily whether the one caused the other, but that they are happening simultaneously. And further research, I think, will be very enlightening in throwing more light on these early phenomena. And then there's, although it's organized differently, Margaret Panau's paper again refers to how the movement of Jamia Millia Islamia within Delhi, from the outskirts closer into town, how that changed the pedagogy and thereby shaped, she would argue, and you'll forgive me for simplifying a very complex argument, how it shaped a changing urban sensibility, which is reflected in the pedagogy that you find inside the university. And finally, the paper that has been jointly authored by Nandini Manjrekar and Poshali Boshak, which really takes a granular look at the education of the children of mill hands, mill workers, again within a neighborhood. So this chapter could also have gone into, and it is part of, conceptually, it's a chapter also discussing neighborhoods, but it also encapsulates a huge frame of starting from the early 20th century through to the peak of industrialization, deindustrialization, and the weakening of trade union movements and so on. So how do we situate education within this broad chronology of space, of site, of place and space? That is what this first section deals with. And to know more about it, read the book. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much to all the editors for talking about their book. I feel like that there are not many questions to ask because you have summed it up so well. But let me open up the floor now for a Q&A. And I already see a question in the chat box. Actually, two questions. So I'm just going to read, each question out, or should we take a bunch together, whichever is better for you?
Maybe let's take a couple or three questions and then we could just.
Okay.
That's okay.
Right. So there is a question from Aditi. It says, does the book look at private educational institutes that were brought up in reference to Sonipat by Dr. Shivali Tukdeo in comparison to private institutes from mainstream urban spaces? Thank you, Aditi. Shreya says this was a very insightful talk. I would be grateful for a bit more discussion on one thing. You spoke about global cities, but I was wondering to what extent urban villages are implicated in these urban educational transformations, especially since Delhi was discussed, and there are a number of such urban villages in Delhi. And Anil has a question, who is pursuing an urban studies PhD scholar at Ambedkar University, Delhi, and trying to look at housing of university students and their relationship with the urban in the context of Delhi. How do you think the experience of the various urban actors will differ along with the character of the educational migrants across regions? So maybe we can take these three first and then go back. Okay.
Sure.
Dr. Tukdeo, maybe you'd like to begin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not able to see the questions fully, but I got, so the first question, maybe I can take on Sonipat, right? About private, were there any private institutions? So I would really encourage you to read that chapter because it's extremely interesting. It focuses on land acquisition, also takes the history of land acquisition for higher education purposes in India for both public universities as well as private universities. So the chapter really deals with higher education and looks at how there is this, construction of Rajiv Gandhi Education Hub in Haryana. For that, a lot of land was sort of acquired, and an agricultural land was sort of obviously used for non-agrarian purposes. But the whole idea it was to have a world-class sort of education hub, which would have innovation, which would have really state-of-the-art higher educational institutions which would have research. So I think the main issues that the paper is really talking about is how new higher educational institutions are being formed on the fringes of urban fringes of big cities, whether it's NCR, whether it's any big city, you would have on the fringes, land acquisition and formation of private universities. So that phenomenon needs to be studied, hasn't been studied very well. And also the connection between education market and land market is also something that is largely missing in the literature. That is something that the chapter tries to kind of focus on. So those are the two elements that are really important in that chapter. About the Delhi urban villages, Geetha, would you like to respond to that question?
You will have to unmute yourself.
The question was just about the urban villages, right?
Yes. And how does one look at Delhi as well as, yes, global cities and urban villages? Yes.
See, Delhi has a certain classification of settlements, official classification of settlements. It has the planned and the unplanned. And Delhi, 24% of Delhi is planned. So the rest is all unplanned. And that has implications for the access to services, access to basic services in Delhi. So that's the thing. But Delhi also has urban villages, right, which are exempted from any of these requirements. So that if you have Munirka and all that, they are allowed to remain, and they are allowed to, for instance, build. Yeah, you must have seen, huge, multi-story buildings, etc. And they're allowed to, so these are very separate kind of spaces within larger Delhi, and they provide, cheap accommodation and all that. So these are the urban villages in Delhi. So you have them. So they continue to remain, whether it's in Munirka, Mehroli, etc. And they are part of the larger. So within the city, you have these villages which are allowed to remain. Yeah, so that's the urban villages of Delhi. About 6% of Delhi's population lives in these urban villages. And they are, people have studied them, and they actually have a very, sort of cosmopolitan kind of population, because you have a large number of students from various parts of India who come and stay in this, because they are cheaper accommodation that is available. Yeah.
Thank you. So the third question was about the experience of various urban actors and how they will differ along with the characteristic of the educational migrants across regions.
Experience of various urban actors?
Yes.
Okay.
Also housing, I believe. So
housing of university students. Geetha,
Yeah.
Is there anything you can say about?
Well, the urban actors, there are diverse actors across social classes. You have the relatively powerful, and very articulate middle classes in the residents, who are actually quite a force, particularly since the 1980s, very active. Then you have, a large section of migrants, the rural, the urban poor, so who are vulnerable, etc. So I think you have a range of actors in the urban context, coming from diverse classes, castes, etc. And what was the second question? And their experiences within the urban. I think Shivali mentioned about the metropolis, etc. But across urban formations, you have, precarity, marginality, exclusion. You have increasing privilege. You have the enclaves, gated communities. And especially with the neoliberal turn, you have a very polarized city, especially very polarized, and that actually, influences the kind of education and access to education that is available. And I think this is there across urban forms, and even in the small town. I didn't get time, actually. I had only 2 minutes for the small town, but even in a small town, like for instance, Piparia, you do have, again, it depends on the kinds of policies, etc. If you have, at least till the 70s and late 70s, in a place like Piparia, since I thought I might as well give a little more on that, you had the, because of agricultural development, etc., you had new social classes coming and new trading communities. You had, since agriculture was really doing well, right? So you had these relatively socially dominant groups. But here you also have the Adivasis whose lands are taken away from them, and they are there on the spatial margins of the city. So in the urban context, these are actors also, I should say. You'll have in Delhi, for instance, in the planned 20% or 23% of Delhi, which is the planned area, you have very dominant social groups, middle classes, you have the professionals, you have the bureaucrats, etc. And in the unplanned areas, you have the more marginal groups, and in the fringes are the sites of precarity. So you have a range of actors, and their experiences would be shaped by their spatial and social location.
So now there is a question about the population of Muslims is large in urban areas than rural areas, but they are basically engaged in self-employment or informal employment, which doesn't require much level of education. Did you find anything in your study regarding this?
Want me to take that?
Yes, sure.
So, so this is correct, that what we find that Muslims, in fact, are even in a more precarious situation in cities than even the Dalits. So this has been shown. So yes, there is this, and that self-employment or informal employment is often not only voluntarily sought. It is, of course, networks that are very important in formal employment, but it's not that it's necessarily voluntary, but that it also has to do with discrimination and not actually getting employment even with education. And so the two studies, which actually the one in Calcutta and the one in Old Delhi, point this out, and also bring up this question, both of them, that the question of policies regarding Muslim education have inevitably had to do with promotion of Urdu and modernization of madrasas. This is a demand actually which has not been the demand necessarily of Muslims as far as education goes. And both show how, both refer to the fact that, especially the one in Calcutta, that there is a secular demand. There's a demand for secular education, which is unfortunately not being met for precarious, poor Muslim communities in Park Circus in this example, but this applies in many places. It's not just in this particular context. That provision of good quality education is simply not there. Accessibility becomes a big problem. And so it becomes a kind of vicious circle. But it isn't that the aspirations are not there. They are there, but there is a sense of resignation, because I think in one of the papers there's an interview with somebody who says, actually says, I mean, where will we ever get those jobs? Nobody. So it is actually something that we need to relate to these wider processes of othering and discrimination as well, and also what is happening within education, where there is not only socially discrimination and economic discrimination that's happening outside, but even within the schools. So you often find this narrative of bullying in schools and so on and so forth. And this comes out in not only in these two studies, it comes out in many studies. Yes, there is this, you're right, but I think one has to also look at this side of things, I mean, why is it that this continues despite the aspiration and the desire to actually be able to access good quality school education and also college education? So I think that's really the question that we may want to address.
That's a question about if the book has a role in pre-colonial education in the context of modern urban school education.
Shall I take that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I always anticipate a question on pre-colonial education when we talk about colonial education. It's perfectly legitimate. There's a problem. First of all, this is an edited volume. We work with what we have, but we also work with certain conceptual framings and ideas that we have. We're essentially looking, this is a sociological volume. This is something that relates fundamentally, although it is about transformation, but it is about transformation today, say of the last 50 years. Essentially, that's the focus of the book. And the papers that deal with the colonial past, in a way, are a setting. They are important, of course, because they provide the historical framing. But there are certain things that I think suggest an element of continuity. The role of the state, the relationship between state and subject to start with, and then state and citizen. Who is marginalized? Who constitutes elites? These are fundamental relationships between the state and society and social groups, which are a feature of our modern society. So, of course, you can go back to pre-colonial times, and one should. It's important to study it, but that was, I think, beyond the scope of this particular volume, given the set of questions with which we approached the volume and the conference that went before it.
I think, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
There is a mention in the, I mean, I didn't have time to go into the individual papers, but in the chapter on small towns, I mean, Banaras, Nirmali does talk about the Banaras as a, historically a city that was seen as a center of culture and indigenous traditions of education. So you had diverse traditions, the Hindu, in terms of Islam and all that. And the way she is, and how she looks at it is that with the coming of colonialism and the new forms of education, there was a lot of conflict between the traditional systems and the new systems. But what is more important is how these families are trying to transit to accessing modern education. So she says that the weavers whose children, who were actually, it was madrasa education in Urdu, and they have to shift to standard Hindi and then to English. And she tries to show that how this is deeply embedded in the local mohallas where these families and their schools are, and how the family, the kinds of languages that they use, both in the madrasa for trading, the varieties of Hindi that are used, and how they have to transit to standard English and then transit to accessing a standard Hindi and then transit to accessing English. So it's very interesting.
I just wanted to come in a bit, add a bit on this. Of course, a lot of literature on this, the relationship between how societies change and, from pre-colonial to colonial. But because our focus was on the relationship with the urban, I think this is something that Nirmali's paper
Nirmali has it.
Exceptional in doing that.
Yeah. Very interesting. And I thought I'd just add, because I was not able to elaborate, she makes the point that though Banaras is a so-called provincial city, the metropolis, and it's sort of the hegemonic, language and culture is actually casts a long shadow on these other cities, because you have to access this kind of education and cultural capital, which is a problem for these the cities that are far away from the metropolis. So it's I think the kind of linkage between across the urban comes out very interestingly in her paper, her chapter.
Just taking off from there, I think even the paper on both Park Circus and Old Delhi also make a reference to this, because you have had and importantly, I think maybe something which I had thought I would say and I completely missed it, was how occupation, we tend to think of fragmentation along caste, region, caste, community, etc., religion, but how occupation and language are two critical markers.
Yeah.
And in those papers as well, they do go back to the pre-colonial. and the communities that have settled in these areas, and where actually what are their what linguistic kind of backgrounds, and of course they don't refer to the lack of linguistic capital that the Banaras paper does, but it's implied because they're also seeking good private low fee private English schooling. So
Yeah.
both those as well actually do. But yes, but of course it's not a focus. It's by way of casting that lens really to understand the.
I think it's the socio-historical lens, which is essential to explain what is happening today. You have to go back in history, and I think all the papers are doing this.
They've all
and
done
it is very interesting to see what happens over a period of time.
But not so much in terms of education. I mean, at least much more in terms of community and the making of these, spaces within the city.
Professor Manjrekar, there's one more question. So you spoke about Anaswa's book on Park Circus, Calcutta, and how children are moving to affordable private schools. So does this chapter or any other talk about the increasing neoliberal NGOs in the urban spaces? How can we look at it? There is also a related question. It is about the growing privatization of higher education in India, leading to new forms of inequality, particularly which affects migrants from Dalit communities and students from lower income backgrounds who aspire to access higher education in cities like Mumbai and Delhi. And especially also at a time when we're discussing about SDG 4, which is about quality education. So how do we think about access to quality education for marginalized communities?
I'll just take the one on the parks, because actually, no, there aren't. I don't think any of the papers directly talk about neoliberal NGOs. Perhaps no, I don't think we have looked at that.
Yeah, but I can say something in general. If somebody
but the paper on Raichur actually is not talking about the neoliberal NGO. It's talking about the neoliberal state sort of promoting certain kinds of. Not major.
Actually,
please go.
So maybe in terms of NGOs, yes, in the post-1990s, there are a lot of non-government organizations which are coming in a form of private-public partnerships. You have Teach for India, etc. And they tend to, in terms of really, dilute the quality of education, because they are, barely trained teachers. They have their own thing, and they enter the government schools. They take certain classes. They have their separate norms. So in a sense, they increase the kinds of, they're a bit divisive as far as schooling is concerned. So you have that. And because you mentioned Raichur and I haven't really said anything, there are NGOs there. What happens in Raichur is that Raichur is a backward district, and this is Supriya and what's the other girl's name? Supriya and Vishaka's paper. What they have done is they are basically looking at government policy, state policy, and a lot of our chapters have important implications for the state and education policy. So here you have the state policy, and I think in 2014 it's sort of implemented to have short-term skill programs rather than long-term ITI education. You have short-term skill programs which are taken on by NGOs. And they give the promise that unemployed youth in Raichur will be skilled, and then they can, there will be social mobility, and they will get jobs in the urban economy. But what Vishaka and Supriya show that this is a very faulty program, because it's a minimal skill, short-term skill, and they can't get jobs in Raichur, because these skills don't address the skills that are needed in Raichur, which is around where these young unemployed people are coming from the villages nearby. They are forced to go to Bangalore, and Bangalore's most harsh living conditions for these, because they get the lowest level of service sector economy, and they get very poor jobs, and so basically what is happening is the government is addressing the needs of the corporate sector for low-paying jobs and skilling these youth who are coming from villages in and around a small town, a town or a smaller city. And in the process, it fails to enable any kind of social mobility, and many want to go back to the rural area. So here you can see the linkages between the rural, the smaller city, and the large city, and what it does to these young people who don't want to break their ties with their villages and would be happy to have jobs and right to. So it's a very faulty kind of education policy, but it gives a sense of what happens to urban aspirations and how they are belied given the nature of education of policy and the lack of development in a very backward district like Raichur. And was there something else?
So we have time for one last question. Basically, it's a question about, it was interesting to hear the point about how a university's move from the city's periphery to its center can reshape pedagogy and academic life. I was wondering, building on that, whether the book also reflects on the reverse, how universities that remain on the outskirts while still basking in the glow of the city's name cultivate distinct educational cultures or student experiences precisely because of that semi-seclusion.
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure Shivali can take it, but thank you for this question. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, both the questions. And I think previously also there was a question on higher education, privatization of higher education.
Yes.
I think these are very important questions. They're also very important spaces to explore. I mean, we may have to have another volume, simply looking at universities, higher educational spaces, transformations, and these are many ways urban spaces. First migration, somebody talked about education-driven migration. First migration, related to education, oftentimes is to the nearby urban locale, because that's where higher education institutions are located. Urban migrants are also many times university migrants or college migrants. But the last question about what happens when, do universities come in the center? And I think historically we do see, I mean, we see, for instance, IIT Kharagpur, first IITs have been, on the outskirts, and then they were almost built with outskirts with the think of maybe, making them a little bit exclusive. And over the period of time, they've sort of come in the center. The way urban forms expand. But I think more importantly, just not just being drawn into the center, we have to think about whether universities have come into the center of the city, in the sense, participating in what is going on, being actually true centers of knowledge as far as at least that location, that city is concerned. I think there is a lot that that sort of has not been done, right? I think the question also was about whether the universities that are coming out on peri-urban locales, do they, what about the experiences of seclusion? And I think that's very correct. It's really interesting how all these universities are dotted on the peri-urban sites where there is nothing really other than that. And obviously, there is a feeling of seclusion. There is, you're learning about the society, but you're cut off from the rest of the town, and hoping that there, yeah. So the sense of isolation and sense of seclusion is what marks the experience of being in those spaces. Very true.
And may I also say that the new universities, the private universities, they're exclusive, and they are on large tracts of land. You take the universities which are near Delhi, and they are on village lands. So a lot of these villages in Sonipat and all that are now sites of universities. And so in a sense, the whole constituting, the urban is being constituted by the rural. I mean, you are, in a sense, wiping out the villages, bringing in, and even schools. I mean, the schools in Gurgaon also, elite exclusive schools, which again are built on village lands. So I think, yeah, this is the way in which the new private universities are coming up, I think, in most parts of India. So they're very exclusive, elite, and they have no relationship with the villages and whatever remains of the villages that are nearby. So, I mean, it's a question as to what is the vision around these universities, and how do they link with people here, or are they basically linking with institutions in other countries? So that is a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all 4 editors, and thank you to the audience as well for being such active participants in this discussion. It has been really worthwhile listening to it. And if you feel like catching it again, it will be up on the YouTube channel and on our blog page. So you can catch it again if you want. And thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Rituparna. I suppose they know that it's an online, I mean, it can be accessed online, the volume.
Yes, we've shared the link in
Oh,
the
shared
chat
the
box
link.
as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yes, it's an open access.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.